They called him a mountain boy, tough, quiet, the kind of man who learned early that a straight shot and a steady hand could keep a family fed. Alvin York grew up in the hollows of rural Tennessee, where winter light turned the hills into silver, and men measured a man by how he walked when the weather turned hard. He was small by most soldierly standards, and pious in a way that made him uncomfortable with the talk of glory and honor shouted in recruiting halls. Hunting was his school, patience, breath control, the calculus of distance learned by heart. A .22 and a squirrel taught him as much about life as any textbook. When the war in Europe swallowed the news and swallowed men, York's name drifted into the federal draft like thousands of others from Appalachian farms. He went reluctantly. He argued with the draft board, wrestled with scripture and conscience, tried to reconcile a vow of nonviolence with a duty to country. He almost did not go at all. A devout man, he first registered as a conscientious objector. But arguments with ministers, the pull of duty to neighbors who'd already gone, and the steady pressure of a nation convinced him that there were ways to serve that did not betray his faith. When the decision came, he joined the army, amazed at how small he felt in the mass of uniforms, amazed at how the same small hands that had steadied a rifle for game could be asked to steady a machine in a war that spoke thunder. Boot camp was confusion and comedy at first, uniforms that never fit, drills that turned farm instincts into military reflex. Yet something in York's bones answered quickly. The discipline of waiting, the silence of the lookout post, the calculus of breath and heartbeat. He was made a marksman not by ceremony but by the direct measure of his days, rifles and targets, the quiet watching of the horizon. The army called it skill, the kind sergeants whispered as luck. York called it a habit he'd learned at a creek at dawn. By the autumn of 1918, York and his company had crossed the ocean and moved into the old forests of France. The Meuse-Argonne offensive was underway, a terrible mechanized harvest in which the Allies tried to cut through the last threads of the German front. The woods were older than the war. They held a million small noises that betrayed men in hiding. The earth underfoot had been churned by artillery into a treacherous mud that swallowed boots and hopes. Shellfire carved new canyons in hedgerows. Soldiers learned fast to read the land for danger, how a snapped twig in the wrong place meant an ambush, how a sudden bird scare meant a patrol nearby. York found himself again in a world where silence was training and patience was power. On the morning of October 8, 1918, the weather had all the doom of late autumn, low skis, a wind that smelled like rain and the distant whistle of shells. York's unit moved in a slow, careful column into the Argonne forest near a village called Châtel-Chehery. Their objective was straightforward in military terms: seize a ridgeline that dominated a crossroads and then push through to interrupt enemy supply and communication. But straightforward in the orders did not mean easy in the land. The ridge was swept by enemy machine gun fire, and the Germans had cut lines and placed interlocking fields of steel that turned open ground into a killing field. The men of York's company, thin and tired, each carrying a weight of mud and machine, knew the odds in a way only soldiers know them. The position they were sent to take might simply be a notch on a casualty list. As the company crept forward, a folktale sort of danger revealed itself. Scouting parties reported a nest of enemy machine guns sighted in a tangle of saplings and barbed wire, a battery that was shredding the advance and pinning entire platoons to the ground. Men went down in ragged, sudden motions, caught, lifted by an invisible hand and gone. The company tried to outflank, tried to call in artillery, tried to move under cover and wait for better light. Each attempt met the same cold metal answer. The German gun crew, well-sighted, well-trained, reloaded like a machine of death. Morale tightened like a rope. York's platoon had been given orders: advance with the battalion, keep pressure on the enemy, and take that ridge if possible. As the first coordinated push stalled and their friends lay motionless in the leafless trees, the situation narrowed down to seconds and inches. Decisions made or not made in the interval between breaths. In the geometry of that little battle, muddy ditches, a ruined orchard, a mill stream of black water, duty and conscience met in the dirt. What separated Alvin York from the rest was not a sudden flair for battlefield courage, but a hard, granular calm. He moved with the silent logic of a hunter. When the enemy guns opened and cut the advance in two, men around him panicked. Commands died in the wind. A small group found itself semi-isolated, cut off, vulnerable, with 5 or 6 Germans in the immediate arc of their fire. The machine guns continued to pour lead into the open like a curse, each burst flattening the field between the lines. A scouting run produced bad news. A German flank had slipped forward and the company's right was exposed. The company commander, a man whose face had been set like flint all morning, barked orders to withdraw and reorganize. Retreat meant surviving, but a retreat under that machine gun umbrella could mean dozens more casualties. Someone had to decide: fall back and live to fight later, or try to silence the guns now and risk the worst. The kind of calculus that turns men into legends was not a bolt of lightning but a slow weighing of human arithmetic. Who could move where? Who could throw what? Who had the steady hand to change a line of fire? York volunteered, not because of bravado but because the logic fit him. He knew the math of a rifle more intimately than most, how a 90-pound man could anchor a shot that decided a dozen lives some yards away. He asked for a few men, and a plan so quietly rendered it felt like a prayer. Slip to the left under the creek, cross where water covered the barbed wire, and take the nest. The plan was audacious in its simplicity and honest in its risk. It demanded a shot that must be made, again and again, through the muddy air and the confusion of broken orders. As they moved, the world contracted. The forest ceased to be a place of future planning and became a set of immediate tasks. Step over that route, drop to the side when the tracer lights thread the leaves, breathe shallow, keep the rifle steady. York's lungs filled with the smell of wet earth and brass. He thought of the creek back home and the careful way he'd taught his little cousins to hold a gun, steady, patient, never wasting a pull. That old school of discipline had nothing to do with glory. It had everything to do with precision. They reached the knee-deep stream, floundered through the mud and crawled uphill under the shadow of enemy fire. Each yard cost a minute and a small prayer. A comrade fell silently, and York felt the immediate duty to press on heavier at the heart. When they closed to effective range, 100 yards, then 70, then 40, the world narrowed to a small field of bushes and a single target, the machine gun nest. What happened next is the kind of moment historians love because it looks from far enough away like a neat, irresistible flash of heroism. From close up, it was a messy, ragged human thing. York's first shots were true. He knocked down the first crewman as the others reacted, stunned to find that the man with a mountain voice and a preacher's hands could shoot like that. York worked the bolt, sighted, squeezed, and the second, then third enemy fell. His accuracy, already legendary on small Tennessee game, translated into deadly efficiency here among men. As the German gun crew stuttered, disoriented and suddenly vulnerable, York and the handful with him closed the distance, bayonet and bolt action alternating with desperate charges. When the gun was finally silent, the shock on both sides was visible like steam. A tiny, exhausted mutiny of breath as enemy soldiers, stunned at the speed and brutality of their discomfiture, raised hands. York's small patrol, just a handful of men by now, some wounded, all tired, stood among the moss and trash in the stillness of the ruined orchard. The machine gun that had been shredding the company's advance lay silent, the air cleared of a noise that had meant death. They did not know then the full consequences. How many lives had just been spared on that ridge because one man could place a bullet where it mattered? They did not yet know that those few captured Germans would swell into an astonishing tally as more enemy soldiers, bewildered by a sudden and inexplicable collapse of their positions, surrendered in numbers the world would later call incredible. They only knew, in that suspended moment, that the field had shifted, the geometry of the battle rearranged by a steady hand. As dawn crept into the trees and the wind carried the distant rumble of artillery, Sergeant York turned, weathered and strange, toward the rest of his platoon. There was a quiet in his face that belonged to someone who had done what he had to do, and then found it necessary to reckon with the fact of it. The smoker's calloused hands that had split squirrel bones were now the hands of a man who had changed a battle's small history. The story did not end in the orchard, but it bent there. The events of that day would be told and retold, how one farmer from the hills captured dozens, and how a single, patient aim could stop a gun that had been an instrument of slaughter. For now, as the company reformed and the wounded were tended, York pulled his coat tight against a cold that felt like consequence, and thought of the creek and of the quiet work of returning home when the world allowed it. They would call him a hero later. For the time being, in the wet and the mud and the riddle of orders, he was only a man who had kept his nerve. The mountain boy with a rifle had made a decision measured not by trumpet, but by the pragmatic arithmetic of survival and the strange mercy of timing. The ridge fell silent after York's decisive action, but the chaos of battle did not. Enemy soldiers, stunned by the sudden collapse of their machine gun position, began to surrender in numbers that seemed impossible. One by one, German soldiers emerged from the trees, hands raised, faces pale with disbelief. York's small team, exhausted and muddy, began rounding up prisoners. At first a handful, then dozens, and soon hundreds, all confused and demoralized. York himself moved among them, a calm presence amid panic. He spoke little, issuing orders with a quiet authority that surprised both his men and the captured troops. The soldiers, used to the unpredictability of combat, were now caught in an orderly, disciplined process. Disarm, register, move them to a temporary holding area. York even had to improvise, using maps to anticipate enemy patrols and prevent any chance of escape. His instincts as a hunter and marksman merged with military logic, every movement calculated for efficiency and safety. The numbers grew astonishingly. By the end of the day, York's patrol had captured 132 German soldiers, all with only a few men and a handful of rifles. The feat became legendary, not just for the bravery required, but for the sheer tactical ingenuity. Where an entire battalion might have struggled for weeks, a single soldier's decisions had achieved what seemed impossible. But the aftermath wasn't over. York's men were exhausted, the wounded needed attention, and the forest remained dangerous. They had to move the prisoners back through muddy, shell-pocked terrain, all while avoiding artillery fire and potential counterattacks. York organized everything with meticulous care, ensuring no prisoner escaped and no Allied man was left behind. Word of the action spread quickly. Commanders in the division were stunned. How had one man, against entrenched positions and machine gun nests, managed to turn the tide of an entire engagement? Reports would later describe it as an act of genius under fire, a combination of courage, precision, and sheer luck. But for Alvin York, the day was not about fame. Each life spared and each enemy captured was the natural outcome of his calm under pressure, his patience, and the discipline he had honed in the mountains of Tennessee. He understood the burden of what he had done, the weight of taking lives, and the responsibility of keeping his men alive. As night fell on the Argonne forest, York and his team rested briefly, the prisoners secured, the ridge held. The full significance of the day would only become clear in the weeks to come, as intelligence reports confirmed that the disruption of German positions accelerated the Allied advance in the sector and prevented further casualties among nearby units. Alvin York had performed an extraordinary mission, not through reckless heroics, but through strategy, discipline, and the remarkable clarity of a man who understood both the terrain and the human element of war. The days after the capture were a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and slow realization. Alvin York and his small team had turned the tide on a critical section of the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Commanders pored over reports, astonished at the scale of what a single soldier had accomplished. One man, with precise marksmanship, calm judgment, and relentless patience, had captured over 100 enemy soldiers and neutralized positions that had been halting the entire battalion. York, however, remained quiet. Back in the trenches and makeshift camps of the Argonne Forest, he was just another soldier. He attended to the wounded, helped organize supplies, and checked on his men. Fame had not yet touched him. The war demanded action, not accolades. But whispers spread among soldiers. The mountain boy with a rifle had done what few believed possible. Weeks later, the story reached Washington, and then the public. Alvin York became one of the most celebrated American soldiers of World War I. He received the Medal of Honor for his incredible bravery, a recognition that praised both his courage and his tactical brilliance. Yet even in ceremonies and speeches, York's focus remained on the men beside him, the ordinary soldiers who had survived because of careful planning and measured action. The tactical impact of York's mission was significant. By neutralizing key enemy positions and taking hundreds of prisoners, his actions accelerated the Allied advance, reduced casualties, and demoralized German troops in the Argonne sector. The engagement became a textbook example of how skill, intelligence, and courage could outweigh sheer numbers. Military strategists studied his patrol, dissected his decisions, and marveled at how one soldier's initiative could influence the broader battle. York returned home to Tennessee after the war, forever changed but humble. He never sought fame, though his story inspired generations. The young farmer who had once measured his worth by hunting and faith became a symbol of brilliance under pressure, calm under fire, and the extraordinary power of a single person's resolve. In the mountains and hollows of Tennessee, he resumed life quietly. Yet the legacy of that October day in the Argonne Forest lived on. It was a story of courage, precision, and human intelligence triumphing over chaos. A reminder that sometimes, in the chaos of war, one measured action can save countless lives and alter the course of history.